Thanks everyone for being here. It's so fun to see so many friends, and it means a lot to me that you're here. So I'm going to start off actually with a bunch of gratitudes. So first of all, I do want to thank the university for the grants and funding that allowed me to take sabbatical last spring and really deeply develop this work. I want to thank my family, Andrew and Esley, who I'm crazy about. I want to thank my department colleagues, especially Jeff Wetzig, who helped me test screen printing early in this process when I thought it might show up in the work, and for Mark Johnson, who helped me cutting unique forms for the painting supports, and also Michelle for support with this exhibition and this talk. I also want to acknowledge the residencies, which are a really big part of my practice and support the work a ton. So the residencies where this work really came to fruition, which include Vashon Artist Residency, Prairie Side Outpost in Kansas, and then the Grand Marais Art Colony up on the North Shore here. And finally, I want to thank my community, including so many artists and friends that are here. Artists for persisting and making your own work. It is so encouraging to talk about things in trade studio visits, and especially have really nerd out painter conversations. So as we chase our best work, and that's also why I've invited Shana to join me, and I'm so happy that she's here. So I'm just going to talk for maybe, hopefully, 8 or 10 minutes, and then we'll start a conversation just to give you a little context for the work. In 2002, I started making collages, and when I've been thinking back to where this really came from, it was when I saw the 2019 Christie's Auction House catalog, which I saw online. They were auctioning off meteors and minerals, and I asked them if they would send me some of their catalogs, which were these really beautifully printed full color books. So I think they hoped that I was a very rich person and I would buy something. But actually, this whole thing made me feel really troubled. I felt like these objects are really mysterious objects thrown down from space, or beautiful things that formed over centuries in the earth, and it seemed like a really misguided reaction to turn them into capital and try to sell them to the highest bidder. And this also relates to, if this interests you, a rise in meteor hunters, of which there are many fascinating articles you can Google to find out about this industry. And I think also this is informed by a really significant experience I had in 2018. I was able to spend time at the Headlands Dark Sky Park in northern Michigan, which received its dark sky designation because it has some of the least light pollution in the US. Being there with minimal disruption from artificial light, the dark sky disclosed wonders. You could see stars like I've never seen, the Milky Way, and actually I had scheduled to be there during the Perseid meteor shower, so I was on a lake, in the middle of the lake at 2:30 in the morning, and it was just unforgettable. So in that place, the darkness really amplified the light, showing color and nuance that I couldn't have seen under less extreme conditions. And I think that experience for me was really about the being present to it all, with full attention in that time and space. And that feels important to me in this current work. So that really motivated the work I've done for the last 8 years. But I think the question that came out of that for me that I'm still turning over is like, it's something I'm seeing, maybe it's an image, but how do you make an image of that thing? It's probably more embodied, it's not really the picture. So I've been just kind of struggling over how to embody this kind of presence in objects. So, okay, these collages, which I've been working on for about 2 years, draw on images that I cut from printed books. It's really important to me the quality of the image. Usually I love the kind of print quality, the surface quality of the paper. And so, yeah, so things like that Christie's Auction House catalog, which I happened to have during the pandemic, which gave me ample time to carefully cut out shapes. But also from books like, I've really fallen in love with the Time Life Library of Photography series, mid-century photo books about land preservation, state parks, and geology. And the nature of these encyclopedic kind of archives started to make my own collection and shape the imagery that I was selecting from. Another gesture towards collecting is that as I cut these books up, I also cut out language that I liked. And it turns out that photo language is really evocative and poetic. So these are all from the Time Life photo books. things like balancing light in two worlds, strange hues from a dark sky, and so you'll see this also showing up with the painting titles. I really loved those collages, and they were kind of a fun surprise. I've never worked in collage in my practice. And so like as a painter, my first impulse is like, oh, I should make these into paintings. I'm gonna make these into really huge paintings. So I started to do this, and you can see some early supports that some of which are in the gallery in a different iteration. But as I started to blow these up into large paintings, I immediately was like, this is really not interesting. Like why would I just copy a thing that actually feels complete and nice as a small collage? And so as I realized that I didn't want to make these into just copies of the collages, I decided to kind of open up just the full archive that I'd been putting together of these images and be really intuitive and respond to the imagery that I was finding there, and then just start to make my own interventions with the imagery. So let's see. As I've been working on this work, I find that like landscape, materiality, the nature of perception continue to be really important to me, and maybe a kind of overarching question that also leads into the title is this question of how I understand the significance of my own brief life in terms of geologic time or millennia. So that is a little bit of a background, this is my last slide, to the work that's in the gallery and maybe some of the context for it. And so now I want to invite Shana up to join me. And Shana has been a really wonderful friend and studio visit partner over the last number of years, and we have a lot of overlaps in our work, and so often there's like really good insight and questions that come out of those visits, and I love your work, so I'm just so happy that you're here.
Thank you. Hi everybody. I see some familiar faces. Can you hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks for showing those slides. The work is so beautiful, and there is a reception after in the gallery, right?
Yeah.
So if you haven't seen it yet, you can go and enjoy it in person. Well, thank you, Amanda, so much for inviting me. It's always fun talking with you, and I think it was Rachel Collier posted on Instagram, 2 painters talking to each other as nature intended. That was hilarious. So I hope we can just be conversational, and also if people have questions, I think that will be welcome to. Maybe we'll pause for questions if you have them. But just to start off, the show is called Deep Time, and you just mentioned a brief, touching briefly on that, what your interest is. Can you go a little deeper into that? How did you land on this idea of deep time, and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, so I started these collages a couple years ago, and when I was at the Vashon Artist Residency, it's in Puget Sound outside of Seattle, it turned out that the residency had a friend who was a retired geologist who agreed to take me and some of the other residents on a geology walk. And during this time, just looking, because I'd been really interested in geology and minerals and all this, I learned so much. And one of the things I learned was this idea of deep time, which is not to think about this experience in terms of my lifetime, which is actually how I think about almost everything. It's like in terms of my experience and my life scale. But to think about things in terms of a geologic scale that has much more to do, like walking through Puget Sound and saying, I would just pick up rocks. He was so patient. I would pick up rocks and, what is this? Why is that? And at one point I picked up a stone and he got super excited. It was this tiny little nondescript brown pebble, and he got really excited. He said, oh, that's the core. And I said, what? And he said, well, the only reason you're finding that here is because of the volcanic activity, and it's very unique to this place. And it just kind of blew my mind. It's like, these are telling stories. And so I think that kind of geologic sense of my life, it's not about my life. It's not about human scale, but a larger scale for the history of the earth and the universe it's within and beyond. Like it got really interesting for me. And I think also, maybe just to go straight there, I know we've talked about this, but I think for me, like we're living in a time where I feel sometimes things are so precarious, and I feel sometimes very helpless. I do what I can to live well in my community and on the earth, but it sometimes feels really hard to not know what to do about things that are huge in the world. And I think thinking about geologic time feels comforting to me. Like this world that is full of beauty is like so much bigger than my own little experience or like our moment. I don't know if that's, yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, and one thing we've talked about is how comforting it can be to shift perspective and shift scale so that, you know, the things that seem so important or difficult or meaningful in our own individual lives, which creates such pressure at times to step back from that, and you're looking at these larger forces and larger, you know, materiality and scale and time that, you know, that we are all existing in, even in this moment.
Yeah.
And I love that about your work. I mean, one thing that I think your work really does, and I think you've used the phrase jumping time scales you've talked about, and I think that's a really interesting concept, because as I was looking at your work, one of the questions I was thinking about was like, what is the time scale of your work? And is it this like perpetual present moment that you're creating, or is it a past bigger event like an asteroid landing on the Earth, or the volcanic core erupting to the surface? Or is it maybe even thinking about the future? Like, what is the future of this place? Is that something you're...
I'm like, am I supposed to answer that? That's a really good set of observations. I don't know if I know. I mean, I don't know that I know. I think I'm aware, like, early on the collages, when I would talk to people about them, when I first started sharing them, I would talk about them as having a quality of being kind of an elegy, because I felt like there's something in, I mean, both like the selling of the objects that felt very sad to me, but then also like a lot of the images. Well, for instance, that image is an image of coral, and so that was from a book that I cut up from the late 60s, and for all I know, that site doesn't exist, either because the world changes or because environmental violence has been done to the space, right? So it's like, I think I have this feeling of, I want to say like the world is so beautiful, and I also feel like crying a little bit, like it feels really vulnerable. So I don't know, yeah. I think there's a quality of like grief processing at the same time that I'm like wanting to forefront like, look, the world is so beautiful.
Right. I think you're really doing that, because I actually, even in my notes, I wrote down, I think somewhere here, what is your relationship to beauty? Is it about grieving? You know, there's something about
yeah, I think it is.
And I sense that in the work, because there's this transcendental quality to it, I think, at times. What's your relationship to that sense? Like there's this levitation in the work, or this like sinking back into an emptiness, or like there's a painting of an X-ray of a crystal, I think.
Yeah.
And that one is like, it's like I'm not religious, but it has this like spiritualist, symbolist kind of quality to it.
Oh, I love that. And thank you for bringing that up, because this is a great time to share with folks, because you won't necessarily know just looking at the painting. Shana's talking about the one on the far left that has that kind of central, almost like a mandala motif. So that image is a 1960s X-ray of a beryl crystal. So that's a category, but it's like an emerald. So if you X-ray the crystal, that's the light pattern that it will make. And I was just totally amazed by that. And yeah, I mean, I think I'm looking, maybe like the beauty thing is like, I'm looking for awe, but I also don't want it to be cheesy, and that feels hard all the time. I think actually I'm gonna talk about a great studio visit that we had. This painting's like, some of my painter, like art friends here know, this painting like really caused me a lot of grief this summer. I started with an image that was one of the first color photographs of Bridal Veil Falls in Yosemite that had a rainbow over it. So kind of like in the bottom portion, there was this really beautiful, pale, chromatic rainbow, and I thought, oh, as a painter, like this seems really fun to figure out how to paint this. Like And also, it didn't really have value. So it wasn't like a dark like shape. It was just this color that was so hovery and light. And I kept trying to figure out how to paint it. And struggling and like talking to all my art friends about, you know, can I paint this rainbow? Is it going to be like the bad 90s Hallmark cards where like the kids have red roses? You know, like it just felt like the cheesy quality was like really, the potential was high. And like kind of during this time, we had a really great conversation where it seems obvious to me now, but it was mind blowing. Shana kind of asked me like, you know, why are you trying to paint the like a picture of the rainbow? Right? It's like, what does it feel like? And that really helped me shift, like, what is happening in this image that is catching my attention or captivating me so much? And I was definitely thinking too, like, that light phenomenon, where like there's a painting of a nebula in the gallery as well. Some of these things are things that maybe optically we can see, but they're brief. You know, they're not kind of material things, they're like optical moments. And so I was kind of like, oh, maybe I'm interested in like immaterial color. Maybe I'm chasing immaterial light. And I couldn't figure it out, but I think that kind of moment of like, oh, like what does this thing feel like in paint? Not what is the picture doing? Was a big help or like reframe for me as I've been chasing this stuff.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting because it makes me think about something that I think we both are working with and grappling with, which is what is the relationship between representation and abstraction in painting or maybe in art in general, and like that sense of, I mean, you are very connected to photography in your work as a source. You're connected in this body of work to making images in a sense, but there's also a lot of liberty with that. And yeah, maybe you can talk about representation, imagination, intuition, abstraction. It's all kind of connected, but yeah, how do those function in concert together for you?
Can I ask you to say more for a second?
Sure.
So I know you shared with me that you had a class about painting that was based in sensation.
Right.
Will you talk just a little bit about like that?
Sure. Yeah, it was a workshop. Basically, the idea was to think about a sensation or physical qualities or material qualities that you would want an artwork to have. Mm-hmm. So rather than thinking of, I want to make a picture of water, think about, I want to make a watery painting, or an image that evokes liquid and gloss and fluidity, and like what are all the qualities, the physical qualities or sensations that it evokes, and maybe that's what I was thinking, maybe that's what one really wants, rather than just a picture of something. And yeah, so that led to this discussion with you about that, like, and I grapple with it myself because I also work with some representational imagery and then also abstract either from that or away completely. So yeah, and it's always something I'm curious about how other artists think about.
Yeah.
Do you think about the sensations or you use the word phenomena, and I was thinking that too. Like it seems like you're trying to capture a phenomena, but you're not a camera, and the phenomena are ephemeral.
Yeah.
So how do you think about grasping those things? Like, is it through the material? Is it through gesture?
No, I mean, these are my questions, exactly.
But you're doing it.
Yeah, no, I'm really excited about this work. I think that one thing that I've been really chasing with like each of the individual works is I wanted the painting's an object, right? In some ways, like it's the dumbest thing around. It just sits there and it's not going to change. It doesn't entertain. Like, just competing in terms of like all the media and stimuli around us. Like it's just this object. But I love paint and I love the materiality of it. So it's like, well, I've been trying to figure out like how do I make a thing that the paint itself is interesting or compelling or doing a thing where when I see it in person optically, it's compelling to me. like photographing or like, posting these images, everything looks pretty great when it's on my phone. It's like everything looks pretty slick. But I think I've also been really trying to figure out, like, how do I love the paint? Like, what can the paint itself do? Like, and I'm using it mostly, like, some of the paintings are incredibly thin glaze paintings, some are super chunky, so they're kind of doing different things, but trying to really understand for each object on its own terms, like, what could make the paint interesting, or like perceptually get my attention. So like that barrel crystal scan, for that one, for me, it's like, okay, the thing about this image is there's like this feeling of deep space or like glowiness that if I could get that into a painting, I'll be really happy about it. Also, it's an image that looks a little bit like a symmetrical, it looks almost like a digital image, but the reality is the X-ray, like the source image, is really not symmetrical. So it's like, the more I started working on that painting, I was like, oh, I've done a terrible thing to myself, because like every single little dot was like a different value than the matching one, or a different shape, or in a different place. And so I think for me, it became very much about paying attention, and it became a really meditative practice or process of like, I'm gonna be patient and show up to this process and kind of trust that if I just keep working, it will, something will happen where it's like, because we were also talking about, when do you know when a painting's done? Which hasn't ever felt like that hard of a question to me. I feel like I'm like, when it's done. But with this work, I'm like, yeah, that's a great question. I don't know when it's done. And sometimes I'm like, someone come take this out of my studio before I ruin it. I threw away 2 paintings I was pretty excited about in the last few months, just because I overdid it. I didn't know when to let the weirdness stay or just like sit with it.
Can you talk about your studio? Like, what's it like for you to go to the studio? Like the actual process, like how does it go from all these cool ideas to an actual thing you're doing in the studio?
Yeah, I love building things, so I would happily build weird stretcher bar structures like all day long, because it feels like a very achievable concrete task. So I do love that. So one part of it is, usually I'll work in the wood shop here, and again, like Mark has helped me a ton, which is amazing, and I will then get these to the studio, and I feel like then I'm kind of set up with this great potential, but I think, so selecting images was causing me a lot of stress the last couple years. Like, I knew I wanted to work with reference images, but for some reason I didn't know how to get into it, or like what to select or why. And then I actually just started thinking about the fact that because of the collages, I had this kind of delineated archive that had certain themes and recurrences, and I was thinking about the algorithm, like any kind of feed that we have in our lives, and the way that the algorithm tends to like show us things that are usually about trying to get us to buy something or like sign on to something, and it occurred to me like I'm essentially a 46-year-old algorithm, like like everything I've taken in through my like life and experiences in visual field. I was like, what if I just fully intuitively chose whatever I wanted? Like I just said, I'm an algorithm, and if I choose enough things, then somebody will show up to my studio or a show and go, does this now make sense, right? I mean, really, it's kind of, but I mean, that's also happening within, I have a limited archive. I'm not just picking from everything in the world, I'm picking images from these cut things that I've already been attracted to for some reason, but I do probably have, I don't know, maybe 1,500, 2,000 images kind of filed away. And so I think that has been really important for me, is to let that intuitive aspect come through of like, I'm feeling really interested in this image, so I'm just going to spend time with it and not try too hard to connect all the dots, but I know that I just need to make more. So in a way, I feel like this feels like a start. Like I want to show you again when I have 50 paintings. Like I think that will start to kind of shape into something more and more. And I also like that I don't know what that is, because I don't know why some of these felt so compelling to me, but yeah, and maybe part of like bringing the wall mural in to try to create a little bit of context or connection with those was a way to bring them into relationship with each other.
Right, yeah, you're giving them a landscape.
Yeah.
Or almost like a memory or a suggestion or an intuitive wisp of a space. I love that the way you talk about your own algorithm, and we had a conversation the other day in preparation for this, and you said, we're all like subject to the algorithm. We always talk about the feed of social media or the internet or whatever, and you had this like really empowering sort of switch around on that, like you were just mentioning like your own algorithm, and you said, I loved it, you said, yeah, like if I just like paint whatever I want, and in a year it's going to show me what my feed is,
Yeah, that's true. No,
I love that, like trusting your own, and and that brings up questions about like how separate or individual are we or not, but certainly we all have our own obsessions or interests, and I thought that was just such a beautiful and trusting way to approach like, what if I just follow my own feed? And I was like, yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do as artists.
Well, then, Shana says to me, well, if you're not painting whatever you want, then what are you doing? And I was like, oh, I feel ashamed. I'm stressing out about what to paint. Apparently you have way more freedom than I do.
No, I share that and recognize that, because I think also there's this like, the professionalism of being an artist, that we have to have the story all figured out ahead of time, and what's in the statement, and what do we tell the galleries, and what's published about the show, and it didn't used to be like that. I mean, the script about your work and your elevator speech and all that. So I do struggle with that too. Sometimes I have to sit back and go like, my God, what do I want to do? Why am I imposing that external thing?
Oh, totally.
So another thing I was thinking about, and we've touched on a little bit, is this idea of scale, and thinking about in the cosmos, large scale, deep time. And I'm thinking and curious about how scale functions in the work that you're making. And I often think about the metaphor of like a bonsai tree or something, and I've used this metaphor in my teaching, but that as artists, maybe we're making like even a gallery size is relatively small compared to the large world. This human scale size thing, so that we can enter it psychically or mentally or bodily in some somatic way, to be able to expand and imagine to enter a more expansive space, whether that's in our mind's eye or our physiological experience. So I was thinking about that, especially with your work, because you are dealing with these cosmic images, geologic and celestial kind of spaces, and yet they fit in the gallery. There's this like, or the
kind of ridiculous.
Yeah, well, the collages are these like, they are kind of miniatures.
Yes.
In a sense, almost like a Persian miniature even, that tradition in painting. So that was really interesting to me. I'm thinking about scale and projection. Like, how do we project into an artwork and then beyond it? How do you think about that? Or does that come into play in your process?
I don't think I intentionally do anything, but when that topic comes up, I'm really interested also, because again, this image of the nebula, which it's so funny because now we've had the Northern Lights so much this year, and everyone's like, oh, you painted the Northern Lights, and I'm like, I love that, why not? But no, it was a nebula. I didn't actually see the Northern Lights, and I'm so burned up about it. And also, hilariously, the center painting, which is an eclipse image, I painted before the eclipse, so I'm having some weird mismatch, like heavenly events moment. But the nebula, it's funny to me that I could never see that with my eyeballs. And even some of these images you probably know that we have of the universe are actually more like diagrams or models that scientists are giving color and shape to so that we can perceive or make sense of it. So even that, it's like you can't see it with your eyeball, but then I'm trying to make this image of it that I can take in or relate to or like evoke something. And then same thing with the x-ray. It's like the x-ray is some attempt to see a thing that you can't really just see with your, like I can hold a crystal, but I can't see this pattern just by like holding it. Or so there's something interesting to me about this, trying to get these images that feel a little hard to grasp. Like maybe the most concrete thing is like the sort of meteor-like painting, which is actually then bigger than the actual meteor would be. So yeah, I think there's something about scale, but like maybe that's the jumping the time scale too, is like, I don't understand any of these things. Like I don't understand how, like some of the minerals that are in the collages, like it's mind-boggling to me how these are formed over time and then they arrive to us with these really beautiful structures, like, you know, the crystals on the left. It really, yeah, it seems really magic to me. Like how do these things exist? They're like the best sculptures ever. And so I think there is something where I'm trying to spend time or like show awe and appreciation, but I'm also, like I want these things to be the things that we can talk about and find beauty in or like grounding in. Yeah.
I think there's like a poetics that you're adding to it. You know, like you're not showing us the Christie's catalog with all their numbers and prices.
Oh, sure.
You know, I mean, you
Yeah. Don't look. No, guys, what do you think?
I mean, you're making all kinds of interesting poetic translations and, you know, filtering all of these pieces of information that you're basically researching, and putting out some kind of like new or other way of seeing them. I feel like you're bringing us simultaneities of, you know, sort of impossible questions. That, I mean, that's probably the thing that art can do, right? I often ask myself, what can art really do? It can present us with ambiguities and conundrums and questions, and it's not solving, you know, it's not a diagram. But I love that you mentioned like how even the things we think of as being hard facts in terms of images of outer space or whatever are actually interpretations and creations, right?
It's funny, I think that if I look at my work like for even like the last 20 years, I feel like there's always some element of failure that interests me, that shows up in the work. And I feel like when you say that, I'm thinking about how much as humans we want to understand totality or grasp or name, or like these books I'm using, right? Like a book of every mineral. And it's like almost as soon as it's published, there's more information, or like it just, things change and we have such a partial understanding. And so I feel like there's also this, maybe like trying to put things together in this way is me being like, what about this? Like, like here's just a sliver, here's a moment. Like, it's not a totality. And these books that I'm cutting apart, it's like they want to be exhaustive, but I don't think that's really possible. And I do love that our knowledge changes, and I also love reminding myself that I don't need to be in charge of any of that or be an expert about any of that. Like the idea of like a totalizing knowledge is not really attractive to me, and so I think I'm just having fun. Like I'm trying to have fun and just like explore and spend time and yeah, look at the pieces that relate or try to understand how things relate and just not be in control of all of it. Just try to appreciate and pay attention.
Well, another thing that I was curious to hear more about, if you want to share, is how you think about your materials. And you talked about loving paint, and there's clearly like that chunky thing at the bottom of the wall there that is really sculptural. And then there's other paintings that are really almost ghost-like. How do you make those decisions in the studio? Like, I think of painting as a verb and a noun, and you're applying some kind of force on the materials to manipulate them. What's that like for you? What's that process?
Yeah, I think some folks might do. So my previous work for about 6 years was really working with these small dark paintings that were very material, very textural, and I really loved that practice. And for me, making those paintings, which really were quite abstract or like non-objective, like there was not an image referent for those, I feel like that taught me a lot about the pleasure of materiality, just like working with the materials and watching like what does this paint want to do at this viscosity, or if I add like flake mica to it, what does it want to do, or if I let it half dry and then try and it was kind of like felt like a collaboration with the materials, and that was, I just really appreciated that practice. And so then when I wanted to start working with image referenced paintings, I felt super stressed out because I was like, I don't know why I need, like, what do I do with this image? Like, I love the image, I'm drawn to it, but the idea of making a picture, like I'm not a camera, right? So I'm not trying, it's not just a technical challenge, like let me make a painting that looks like the picture, because that actually was immediately boring. So then that brought up this question of like, well, what do these things want? I guess for me, I feel like I'm looking at each image, I'm getting the scale, and I'm trying to figure out, what do they want? Like if I start to glaze something in and it's very light, sometimes it feels like, oh, this painting needs to get disrupted by some like aggressive values. Or sometimes it's like, oh, this needs to get lighter and lighter. Or like with the meteor, I just felt so obvious, and it was so weird because my older work that was non-objective, I really felt like I was departing from that practice when I started these paintings, and then all of a sudden I was like, oh, you're back, I have a meteor. I can like still like have this super material exploration. But then it's a little weird because I'm looking at the structure of an object like the meteor and trying to make the paint sort of high-five it, but not be it. It's like, you know, it's like I'm not like 3D scanning it and trying to make it, but I somehow want there to be like a connection, but the painting has to also do its own thing, which that's been the fun thing and the hard thing about all this work, is I'm like, where does it get goofy? Like I'm doing a theater set, you know, I'm like making meteors that are kind of pretending to be this theatrical object, or when can I get them to actually feel like, oh, this feels like a magic object, or like something, I don't know, I've been using that phrase in my head for a couple years, like a magic painting. Like to me, I'm like, when the work feels like it has this quality of magic is when I feel like it's optically and materially doing something that gets me. And I guess that's a subjective, personal edit on like, what is that?
Or like it's doing more than just the stuff it's made of.
But then you can still see exactly what it's made of,
right?
Which I love about paint.
Right.
It is
like this image, this rough hewn kind of, it's a flat form, but it's got this topography to it, and it really does start to feel like it's something other, you know, like it's not just a piece of wood with some material stuck to it. It feels like it got dug up or something, or it was part of the earth, or, you know, like it extends beyond itself.
I love that. Now I'm like, oh, I should bury them and dig them up. And they'll really have some personality. But no, yeah, I do want to, I want to try to understand each image kind of on its own terms, and I think too, things that feel like mistakes or weird steps, I'm trying to embrace and listen to and just let it be a part of the process.
Okay, well, I remembered my last question.
Oh, good.
So it has to do with the color scheme or tonal scheme, maybe. There's so much black and white in your work, and that's been pretty consistent, I think, in a lot of the work of yours that I've seen. You've used gold, and you've used like metal powders and mica and actual, you know, physical material like that mixed into your paint. This show there's a little bit of color that shows up here and there. But I wondered if you could just talk about that. It's such a, there's such a purity, I feel like, in a way, I don't know if that's the right word, but your work has explored darkness in the past, and I think this work is exploring a kind of simultaneous darkness and lightness. And I'm not ascribing meaning to those terms per se, but yeah, is there anything you want to say about that, why that's?
Sometimes I feel like color is so seductive. It's so beautiful and loud, and like it will get all my attention every time. And there's something about something being a little bit stripped down sometimes, or saying like, I don't know, it's maybe the same with the collages. You were saying poetry, or I think like the idea of I really love poetry because poets have to be so careful in their language choice, right? You're limiting yourself, or like a haiku idea, it's like you're trying to make an association or reference with very little, and I like that constraint of the very little. And so maybe there's something about some of the limitations in the value range or the material range where it's like, if I only work with this, can I still get there? And for me, maybe color's distracting because it's like, I don't know. But I really love, like the color in there is mostly kind of glaze paintings. And I love spending time with that because that builds up slowly over time. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it does lend, I think that's part of the poetics of the work is, it's almost like you're removing the moment from the lineup of moments in a way. Like I feel like it's, and I often feel like this about the studio itself is like a separate space, you know, where I can connect to the world, but I can also, it's sort of a buffer from totally the world, and that in a way ties back to some of the things you said at the beginning, like our human time and scale is so troubling. How do we actually step back and see something bigger? So I feel like that black and white also lends itself to that too.
Yeah, it's a limitation.
Yeah.
Or like it quiets things down, I think, for me. Thank you. So I know I also wanted us, before we close, so in the interest of time, if we would I would love to talk, I'm sure Shana would love to talk further with anyone. So in the gallery, like let's just keep talking, come over and we can continue the conversation. But I did want to close by saying, what's next for you? So I can start and say, what's next for me is, I just got back from sabbatical, which was so lovely. I'm working on some applications for residencies and exhibitions, but also I'm pretty excited about the work. What's next for me is just like keeping my own weird algorithm going and making paintings, and so that's kind of where I'm at. How about you? What's next for you?
Let's see. Well, in about a week and a half, I'm leaving for a month-long residency in Vashon Island in Washington State, which I'm super excited. And actually, it was Amanda who turned me on to this residency, and it looks really beautiful. It's just like a little studio on a waterfront in the bay. Is it the Sound?
Quartermaster Harbor.
Quartermaster Harbor outside of Seattle. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm in a transitional space in the work itself, but just sort of trying to keep plugging away. And I think that right now I'm just exploring ideas that have to do with how does light and luminosity work. And weirdly, it's turning me toward dark tones to be able to like pull light out of darkness in some way, just visually with paint. And it has to do with thinking about energy and solar energy in particular, and oil, crude oil. And so this kind of connectedness between something very ephemeral and luminous and something very heavy and sticky and dark, and earthbound. So similar in a way, some kind of connection. So.
Yeah, we always find connection.
Yeah.
But I would encourage you, if you don't know Shana's work, look up, check out her website, and yeah, you'll enjoy that. So thanks everyone for coming.